It is so good to be back from the break that we had. We are starting a new conversation series today called The Great Cloud of Ancestors, Learning from the Stories We Never Hear. In the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament, chapter 12 starts off, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses." This passage has been interpreted in many different ways over the years. But the most common understanding of witnesses in this verse is those who came before us. In this word, the word witnesses is translated from the Greek word martos, which is literally translated correctly in this passage. But in this ancient society and many cultures still, ancestors are the ones who bore witness past and bear witness present. They use their witness to guide those who come after them. So in the context of this passage, in order for us to grasp the cultural significance, I believe that it is more correct to translate martyrs as ancestors instead of witnesses. This switch allows for the passage's nuance about those who have gone before us. It allows us to glean the lessons from the ancestors and to hear their stories as our own. After all, the context of the rest of the passage is that we will build on the work of those who have gone before us so that all of us, past, present, and future, can step into the fullness of God's promise. Growing up in the West with Eurocentric ideals, ancestors is not a concept that I really came into contact with. At least not in the same way that many of my peers from other cultures around the world would have. And however you hold on to the concept of ancestors, I think we can all agree that we can be guided by the stories, life, and energy of those who have gone before us. That is the point of this series. We want to hear the stories of those who have gone before us and listen to how our ancestors are guiding us into the future. There's a movie called Antoine Fisher, starring Derek Luke and Denzel Washington. It is about a young man who was raised and abused in foster care, and the movie is about him searching for his family that he never knew. He is constantly guided by a dream where people he has never seen or met lead him to a great feast in what looks like an 18th or 19th century barn. He instinctively knows that his ancestors are calling out to him, inviting him to come home. He begins to put the pieces together of all the different stories that he has heard and documents that he has read. Eventually, he finds his family who welcome him in just like the people in his dream, except for now, it is in a contemporary urban dwelling. We grew up hearing stories of people we probably had never seen or met. Stories that were meant to help us learn who we are. And if you're like me, having grown up in the Christian tradition, many of these stories came from the Bible. And far too often, we only told and retold certain stories from the Bible. Usually, these were stories about those who eventually had great power or influence. We tend to like those stories. We tend to want to be reminded that great power and influence are possible, and then we imagine that we could also wield great power and influence. But those stories are not really the stories that help us learn who we are. It's the stories that rarely get the spotlight of people standing up to power, of people faithfully living their lives without great influence. These are the stories we most relate to because we are living our lives without great influence for the most part. But these stories don't capture our imaginations. I want to focus on one of those stories, and then from that story, allow it to shape my sanctified imagination, to borrow a phrase from Dr. Wilda Gaffney. Before we carry on, you're probably asking, what is a sanctified imagination? According to Dr. Wilda Gaffney, the sanctified imagination is the fertile creative space where the reader enters the text, particularly the spaces in the text, and fills them out with missing details, names, backstories, detailed descriptions of what the scene and characters, and so on. So let's talk about Shiphrah and Puah. Shiphrah and Puah are two of my favorite characters in the biblical narratives. Their faith and refusal to bend to the whims of power encourage me to this day. They use the tools at their disposal, which in this case happen to be deception, in order to defy and resist and oppose power. Throughout my years of biblical study, I've heard Shiphrah and Puah described as Egyptians who were midwives for the Hebrews, or they might have been midwives that were Hebrews. I don't know enough of the grammatical nuances of both arguments to defend either position, but I like to think that they were Egyptians who defied Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And it would line up, for me at least, narratively, with the promise given to Abram before God gave him the name Abraham. I will bless those who bless you. When Pharaoh put out an order to kill all the Hebrew male babies, these two women defied Pharaoh and lied to the most powerful person in the land to save the lives of these babies. The story of the Hebrew midwives ends with this note: because the midwives feared God, God gave them families of their own. In the ancient times that this story takes place, to be blessed with offspring was the biggest blessing one could imagine. I want to jump forward now to another story, a story that after Christmas is probably a lot closer to our memories. After the birth of Jesus, Herod, another king bent on infanticide, seeks to kill baby Jesus. So his parents pack up their things and they flee to Egypt, a place where many of their ancestors had fled over and over again to escape calamity. In my sanctified imagination, I imagine that when Joseph and Mary fled to Egypt from the infanticidal threat of Herod, they were welcomed, embraced, protected, and cared for by the descendants of Shiphrah and Puah. That the children of the heroic Hebrew midwives would once again find a way to defy the whims of the powerful, to protect the vulnerable and powerless. The story of Shiphrah and Puah always conjures up hope in me. Even though it is not there, their story belongs in what I grew up hearing called the Great Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Even though the author of Hebrews doesn't tell their story, it doesn't mean that we cannot. I think naming those whose stories we need to hear and listen to is essential. Shiphrah and Puah are part of the great cloud of ancestors who have gone before us and still beckon us to resist and oppose the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Before I conclude, another interesting connection to this story is a man named Apollos. He is a well-educated and eloquent Jewish man from Alexandria, a city in Egypt. He is on a very short list of possible authors for the letter to the Hebrews. After the Exodus, the period when Shiphrah and Puah lived, there were two mass immigrations of Jewish people back to Egypt. The first one was during the destruction of Judea at the hands of the Babylonians. Many Jews went to Egypt and settled, including the prophet Jeremiah. The second was during the Ptolemaic era, about 300 years before Jesus. While their kin in Judea faced oppression from dueling empires, the Jews in Egypt were left to live in relative peace. Again, in my sanctified imagination, I like to think that the descendants of Shiphrah and Puah had something to do with protecting the people who were looking for safety in the midst of oppression and tyranny. I like to think that it is quite possible that we are reading about the great cloud of ancestors today because of the foundation to defy oppression that Shiphrah and Puah laid down for us thousands of years ago in Egypt when they stood up to Pharaoh. Their legacy tells us that we can continue building on their foundation, that we can continue to defend the vulnerable. Shiphrah and Puah didn't do this with violence, but by defying power. Violence in their story was a tool of the oppressor, a tool of oppression. Their imagination was more expansive than responding to violence with more violence. Their imagination left a legacy of care and protection for the vulnerable. I want to leave you with this quote from Marion Wright Edelman. Be a good ancestor. Stand for something bigger than yourselves. Add value to the earth during your sojourn.